Welcome to the Prime Venture Partners podcast. I'm your host, Amit Somani, and I am delighted to have with me today Parag Naik, co-founder and CEO of Saankhya Labs, attempting to be India's first fabless semiconductor company. So welcome to the show, Parag.
Thank you, Amit. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
So Parag has been a veteran in the semiconductor industry. He was just mentioning that he started his career in the early days at Philips. He's been an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur, maybe a parallel one too. I don't know. We'll find out in
Yeah.
the course of the conversation. And most of his kind of journey has been around the semiconductor space. So I'm really excited to learn a lot of new and interesting things from him. So Parag, maybe you can give our listeners a quick background on your journey and a quick description of what Saankhya Labs does.
Sure. Very quickly, I graduated in '92. I'm from one of the private colleges, so like to call ourselves, we're not the pedigree dogs. We're all the country dogs. Right? That messaging is very important because a lot of time people get hung up over degrees and flaunt those degrees, right? So, and somebody from a private college without cracking GAE or probably GATE can do this stuff. I think a lot of other kids can do better. So I graduated in '92. My first job was in Mumbai. I worked for Patni Computer Systems for about 6 months. Then I joined a small company in Bangalore that was working on the light combat aircraft, what's now inducted as Tejas, into the Indian Air Force. So I worked a lot there on embedded hardware and software, and that's where I got my first experience with working in the hardware and in the software space. Most of my career, I've been trading the line between hardware and software, right? And by the way, now in this company right now, we have pivoted so much that we are also doing mechanical and thermal stuff. So, if there's a problem to be solved, you solve the problem. You just don't get boxed yourself into one particular silo. So between '92 and '95, I worked with DRDO as a private contractor, building mission computer hardware and software for the Tejas aircraft, which is now inducted into the Indian Air Force. Then in '95, I joined Philips Research. Philips was just starting off here in Bangalore. And then I shuttled between Philips, Holland, and Bangalore for about 5 years, living about 2 years in Holland and about 3 years in Bangalore, going back and forth and working with Philips Research with some of the top minds in Europe at that time. Actually, was really a great learning opportunity for me. Thought processes, especially working with the Dutch guys, right? So in India, we think the Americans are very blunt and straight. Wait until you see a Dutch guy. So in fact, a lot of Americans find us extremely direct, and so that's some of those traits that we picked up. Mostly good, I think, in hindsight, in Eindhoven and working with a lot of folks in Philips Research. We were exposed to a whole lot of problems there, building operating systems, building chips, and those days were the days when digitization journey had just started. In fact, we worked first on the world's first set-top box in '95, '96 timeframes. Set-top boxes those days used to cost about $1,500. So it was, and DVD players. So that was a big thing. In '99 or 2000, when there's all this, a lot of your audience might not remember that those early days. One of the first booms that we saw and the busts also that followed later. During those booms, practically everybody was going IPO in India in '99, 2000 timeframes. And then we decided we had about 7-8 years of experience that kind of plateaued out in Philips with very little management background. Me and a couple of my co-founders were also my colleagues in Philips, and some of my classmates started a company called Smartintra. And in 2000, we started that company. We didn't know what we were getting into. In fact, one of our managers told us, before you learn to jump from the fifth floor, learn to jump from the first floor, right? Those days, being young, we were about 28, I think, 27, 28, 29. Being young and doing a startup was not fashionable, right? It's changed so much in the last 15, 20 years. In fact, it was a liability, not an asset those days. But some angel funding, we started Smartintra, not knowing what to do, frankly. In fact, I remember my first day when I actually had resigned from Philips and we were starting Smartintra. We had got out, and for a minute, I was unnerved, right? Because 29 years of your life, you always had somebody to tell you what to do, right? And suddenly on one particular day, now it's freedom, right? But it's like a tiger out of the zoo. It's freedom, but you have to hunt now for yourself. So it was extremely unnerving. It took about 15 minutes to get over that feeling. And I think since then, we never looked back. So Smartintra, we ran until 2004. In fact, in Smartintra, we built some very interesting technology now that actually now passes off as screencasting. So screencast actually was invented in India by us. but we didn't know what we are sitting on. There's no concept of patenting. They don't know how to market these things those days. But having said, in fact, we are not as narcissistic as we are today. We don't even have a picture of those demos that we should have actually built in 2002.
Yeah, Parag, lots of follow-on questions. Apologies to kind of interrupt here. So I think one very interesting thing that you said is when you started out Yantra, your first company, you really were like, okay, so what are we going to do now? Both in terms of the philosophy and psychology, right? In terms of like, there is no boss, I'm the boss, or I need to like control my own destiny kind of thing. Second, and actually wanted to, through the course of this podcast, explore the anatomy of building a hardware or a deep tech startup, right? Which takes longer gestation period. So how did you, not just there, but maybe you can just cite anecdotes from Yantra as well as Saankhya Labs. How do you figure out what is the problem that you want to solve? That will be a meaningful, interesting, worthwhile pursuit commercially, not just at a research level.
Some of us have been tinkerers, Amit. I mean, sometimes, maybe we have been accused a lot by the finance guys of not looking at finance as much as business as much as we do. A lot of times we do it because we do it for the sake of it. But having said that, there was a general method to the madness, right? So in 99, 2000 timeframes, everything was going over IP, right? Now, something over IP, voice over IP or audio over IP is very clear. Video over IP was something which was very new. So we thought that we should play in that space, right? And build some things around. That's what OTT is all about, video over IP. And we called it video over IP those days. That's the overall business stuff that he had. But right from the beginning, right from the time when we were in Philips, one of my co-founders, Vishwa, has got a PhD from Indore Technical University. Him and a few others in Philips. We are always worried about, not worried, I would say, always wondered why can't we actually build a deep tech engineering ecosystem in India, right? In fact, in the last 25 years of my career, I've seen, I call ourselves mythbusters in sense. Earlier, they said in India, we couldn't do software. When we started Philips, the European guys there said, you can't do embedded software. Then they said, you can't do the chip. Then we did the chip and all of that. So the overarching idea was video IP there. I will talk about how we came about with Saankhya a little later, but then the idea was to go build something out there. And then sometimes you have to be brash and foolish also, I think. In fact, one of the popular VCs, I can't name him on the show, we had gone to meet him at that time. I think he said, you have to be either brave or foolish to do that. I said, we're both. Sometimes, so, I mean, for us, it's always been a series of experiments. We started off Smart Intra saying, okay, let's try this for 3 years, right? And see what comes out of it. And then take it from there. And luckily for us, some of those experiments paid off, some of them didn't pay off. And like your VC investing, right? It's statistical. You do 8 or 10 things, and a couple of them actually take off. And we have never stopped. From the age of 25 to 50, we've never lost our curiosity, and we've never lost our ability to tinker. And we always get excited, even at this age, to play around with it. That actually held us in good stead. And in fact, what happens is when you're building, unlike business model innovations, when you're building something tech, you have to project sometime into future and take a bet on what could potentially happen 10 years from now. In fact, in Smart Intra, we were too early. Again, even Saankhya, we were early, right? Saankhya, we started off with the notion of building programmable architectures. So if you look at the whole goal of computer science is to raise the level of abstraction. It's the corollary to Moore's law, right? Every 18 months, you get doubling of compute power, but every 5-6 years, you get doubling of or maybe increase in productivity, in programmer productivity. Today, a lot of folks, back end and front end, and I don't know what all kinds of sobriquets they put on LinkedIn, especially on full stack and half stack and all of that, have come in because of programming abstractions. Right? So how do we take that programming abstraction? So if you look at the evolution of programming language, I just wrote a blog on LinkedIn. You can go and check it. Your audience can go and check that. We have progressed from assembly to C++, Pascal, C++, Java, then right now Python and all of this. So these are all expressive languages, right? They've got one step ahead. Similarly, on the hardware side, the goal of hardware is to go away from hardwired stuff, right? We went from analog to digitized digital architectures where a lot of compute power is there. And even in compute power, where there are hardwired architectures, which means you do fixed function hardware. Like, for example, you got an MPEG accelerator or hardware graphics accelerator, where even that is programmable now, but generally they used to do it, that gets programmable. So we latched onto the fact that riding on the back of Moore's law in Saankhya, we could actually build a programmable radio where you write your waveforms and protocols fully in software, right? It was called a software-defined radio. So that was too early at that time. But now, in the last couple of years, in 5G deployments, everybody's talking about it because now you've got enough compute to be able to do that. That's something that we looked at in Saankhya. These things actually take 8 or 10 years, right? Because if you're competing against an Intel or a Qualcomm, you have to compete against an idea that on ideas and stuff that they're not looking at. It's like I like to say, the Shivaji and the Mughal army analogy that I like to give. You have to pull them onto the mountain, right? You can't take the Mughal army on the plains. You will be squandered. So if you play the game as per Qualcomm or Intel, you will be squandered because you are already starting behind, way behind. You don't have the resources. So you have to find your niche out there. And that's something that everybody continuously needs to do.
Wonderful, Parag. So I think lots of interesting things you said. One that really connects with me a lot is tinkering. And one of the things I don't necessarily kind of like about the Indian startup ecosystem is because we don't have a mega culture, pedigreed or not, of grad school and PhD programs. The amount of tinkering time is much more limited. People want to just jump in, even the entrepreneurs, forget the VCs, just jump in and build it and start selling it and getting some market validation and so forth. There are merits to that, but I think there's a lot to be said about tinkering and trying different ideas or technologies which inherently need more gestation. So I'm really glad that you've kind of adopted that as a religion. The second thing I really loved what you said is brave and foolish. I'm going to use that. I think you need to be brave and foolish, and if I may add, smart, right? Like you got to have some method to the madness of your bravery and your foolishness, right?
Yes.
So I kind of really like that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about if there are, hardware or semiconductor or other kind of entrepreneurs listening into the show, given what you have learned in your journey, what are some kind of tips or suggestions you would give in the early days of their journey? Imagine the first 3-4 years of Yantra or first 3-4 years of SDR. Knowing what you know now, what would you recommend other people do differently?
One thing that I would do is I always have realized this over a period of 7, 8 years or 10 years, I think. It's about the psychology and not the technology a lot of times, right? Well, technology is a necessary condition. Psychology, the market psychology and all is very important. We actually, when we started Saankhya, I think we started around the same time as Flipkart, I think 2007 or 2008, 2007, I think, around that part. And also another company called YY, which also builds, compilers for drivers. It generates drivers on the fly. We were again up against the system. I mean, we've for too long and too far, we've gone up the system, right? Gone against the system, against the grain. And sometimes it's extremely demotivating and very, very frustrating, right? And I would sometimes say you have to play there a bit smart. There you should be foolish. You have to try and understand the behavioral psychology of the investor and the overall market sentiment and all of that. If we had probably started in the valley and then probably moved back to India, that would have been a better idea. But now I think the ecosystem in India is slowly building up for tinkering and all of this. But still, it's extremely nascent, right? I mean, I don't know if you know this movie called Golmaal, the original one. Amal Palekar and Utpal Dutt. And Amal Palekar's character first meets Utpal Dutt there, and he says, "आपको कैसे मालूम है भवानी शंकर बुड्ढा है? जिसका नाम भवानी शंकर होता है बुड्ढा ही होता है." So some of them are पैदाइशी बुड्ढा, right? So what we are creating is a bunch of fellows who are too bothered about success. I think when you're too much worried about success and wanting to become a unicorn or wanting to get onto this Me Too shows which talk about Me Too business models. so that's the problem. So that's where you lose your curiosity, and then you have to have a love for the subject. I think that trumps everything else, right? And trumps everything else. I mean, we don't need external validation. If you love the work. And I just read a quote, and that's one of my favorite ones. In fact, I keep it in my office here. Two of them actually. One of them is basically that it's neither the journey nor the destination. It's the company. If you're in company of the right people. In fact, some of us have grown old from the age. At least 8 or 9 of us have been together from the ages of 26, 27, right? Sometimes our wives think we spend more time with them with these guys than that. So over a period of time, you build that rapport with people that, it doesn't matter what you do and how you do it, because you're spending a lot of time with this, and then the culture that you build around that. And the second one that I like is, I often say is this Gabbar Singh's dialogue, right? That also I've put outside my office. I think people in office call me Gabbar Singh for whatever reason it is. But anyway, I look like what. So, jo dar gaya, samjho mar gaya. So if you're scared, you're gone, right? Those are the two mantras that I think we we like to live by.
Yeah, wonderful. So I love your quotes and your stories. And of course, I'm a big Utpal Dutt fan, and especially from that movie Golmaal. I think his dialogue in that movie, and I'm going to try to imitate him now. Like khao khao beta aur puri khao ye tumhari aakhri puri hai. I mean, that was just a classic movie.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to your notion about psychology, not technology, and as well as the Shivaji example, saying you can't play on the turf to the strength of the incumbents or the 800-pound gorillas. So whether it is Intel or the erstwhile kind of Fairchild Semiconductor kind of starting of some of the VC world. So how do you figure out that those folks are not playing in it, and how do you assess out if you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to see? One is, of course, like you said, be autotelic, do what you love, tinker, don't worry about unicorns, unicorn, like just go build interesting stuff. But if you want to go play at least in a space where you think it's interesting, but there's not like that much interest at the edge of the network, right. Pun intended. How do you figure that out?
I think you just have to jump into it, right? And with a curious mind. In fact, for us, at least we play in a space in semiconductors. There are three basic major, from a fabulous perspective, streams, if you will, right? There's compute, there's communication, and there's memory, right? Memory requires a lot of device physics and stuff like that. So we couldn't play in memory. In communications, basically, it's all about architectures, right? So semiconductors is now like, in some sense, VLSI design is like a horizontal scale. Like software. So if you know VLSI, so what, right? Similarly, if I know C, C++, so what? You know the domain. So you got to know the domain. And in fact, we spent a lot of time inside the domain, right? And worked with some of these companies. And then we know exactly what these guys are looking for and what they're not looking for. It's a combination of market intelligence, having a network, being in that for reasonable. That's why I think semiconductors very rarely, unless you're doing a PhD, right? Which means you already got a 5-6 year thing that you're doing some depth into it. You just can't start off attacking them, right? We already had 8 or 10 years. And then after Smart Intra got acquired, for 2 years, I was part of the CTO office in a NASDAQ company called Genesis Microchips, which is a world leader in building LCD TVs. So there we got a overview of what's happening, where the overall industry is headed. With the tinkerer background mindset and with this market intelligence, we said, yeah, this is the time to do something in this particular area. And it has to be sufficiently reasonably far off, right? Especially if you're operating in India. But I'll tell you what, I've also learned that ecosystem trumps technology any day also. Because in China, because you got an ecosystem of semiconductor companies, just like once Infosys went public here in India, everybody started a software services company, right? And software services companies are dime a dozen now. And that's going to happen even in the SaaS world and other places. So in China, you have an ecosystem that actually allows you to build these very specific points. And you can, if your friend is building a product, so he'll buy from you. So in India, we don't have that ecosystem, right? We don't have a Samsung or a Oppo or a Vivo or whoever it is that we can sell to. That ecosystem is in there. And when you don't have that ecosystem, you have to still look out further up, 10 years hence.
Right. So help me understand, let's say you're tinkering around for a couple of years, right? You're making some progress. You understood the ecosystem and a little bit of the market landscape, right? Kind of where are the big gorillas not playing, but they're interested. Now, how do you go about validating whether you're onto the good path? Of course, there's the product and you're saying, oh, I can do this 10x faster or 5x faster, or I can see, some OTT application running on, something over IP, right? Video over IP, or audio over IP, etc. But how do you know, okay, now actually, eventually, whether you like the finance guys or not, you have to go build a business around it. You have to get a customer to pay you to make sure that you're creating some value. How does that process look like in a hardware startup?
You know what? Most of the hardware startups actually, if you look at least in the Valley, are started by guys who are working in, say, one of these companies. And then they go, it's like a spin on, I don't know, it's called a spin in, I think. Cisco calls it a spin in.
Spin out, and then they get acquired back to a spin in.
Then that's a different thing. So people know what the issue is. So the product marketing guys go out there and there. So one of the other things that I would have done differently is get on a customer much earlier than we did at that time, right? We went back into our kind of a rabbit hole and said, we will build this technology and then come out. So that process is something that I would have done differently. So ideally, it's good to get on a alpha customer. And again, none of them are in India, unfortunately, right? That's why the ecosystem is either in China, Korea, or in in the valley, as in some places in Europe. So you go there, you have these networks, and one of them, see, you talked about Fairchild, right? How did this Fairchildren come about? Somebody thought, yes, I trust this guy. In fact, I raised my first rounds of money from our angel investors. In fact, my angel investors are dotted all over I call them the NH4 angels. The NH4 is a road connecting from Bangalore to Pune. I've got all small towns from Davangere to Hubli, Gadag, Belgaum, Satara. People like that have put money on this, right? In a semiconductor company, you would have expected one of a Sequoia or somebody else to come and put. They didn't. None of them did. So these guys know, okay, I like this idea. I don't know where it's going to go, but here's some money. Take this money, right? So you have to find those guys wherever they are. And of course, because earlier we had given a very good return in 3 years to our investors, these guys jumped on. So unless you have that, you do not know whether the idea is going to succeed or not, because there's no such thing as an MVP that I can build. It takes at least 3 years to actually build an MVP, right? And then you don't know whether you're right or wrong about it. And then one other thing you have to do is, of course, you have to be capitally frugal, because the entry barrier itself is pretty high. The tools are expensive. Engineering talent is extremely expensive. So we did a lot of jugglery around. In fact, we have probably the world record at that time for cheapest tape out, fastest time and the least amount of money to build a chip out. So that was a combination of partnerships with companies like Toshiba, customers, and some very hard negotiations with 800-pound vendors also. All your vendors are very big. TSMC and all these guys are $50 billion companies. So Samsung is you are a customer to Samsung, but Samsung is our vendor. So it's very difficult to deal sometimes with them. But then get that customer, and then again you are probably, in the mathematical sense, your least figure. You'll never have the perfect fit. Least squares figure you will have, and then you should be able to kind of modulate or pivot around. In fact, we have pivoted at least 2 or 3 times before we finally found our real slope, so to speak, to take off. So that's a process that somebody in the team has to continuously look at.
Right. I love this phrase, NH4 angels, right? I've heard Highway 101 angels in the US. I've heard the Eastern Corridor, right? In Boston, New York, Connecticut, that area. But NH4 is I think that's a new one. That's a new one for me. So building along, obviously, like you said, there's NH4 angels, but, that may not be enough, right? If you're really getting into sort of some deep tech stuff. So how is capital raising, and how do you convince investors, institutional investors, to come along for the journey? So you've done the NH4 round, you've got some prototype, maybe 1 alpha customer, 2 alpha customers, right? But now you need to go raise some meaningful amount of capital. It could be a few $1 million. I'm not talking tens of millions of dollars, whatever, right? $2, $3, $5 million. How does that process work, and any suggestions and learnings from that?
I'll tell you our story, and then maybe you can. I think now it's a little bit easier if you have a sufficiently advanced enough technology, because right now there's so much focus back onto semiconductors in the last couple of years that everybody gets funded practically now. So if you do some reasonable thing in semiconductors, you'll get funded now, in the next couple of years at least. When we started off, in fact, we practically, right from 2000, after we got the angels to the time, we got our first step out, we were continuously looking for investors, right? And all the financial investors, we did the round of all the top VCs in India, all of them said that you guys can't do this, right? It's not a India story. It's not a Bangalore story. It's a Valley story, right? Nobody was willing to take that leap of faith. In fact, I can't name this. One of the top houses here in India also came close to investing in us, but they chickened out, because saying it's one of their first investments. They don't want it to be a failure. That's a problem with a lot of Indian entrepreneurs, right? For successful entrepreneurs, unlike say Musk or somebody in the US, we get trapped in our own success. People don't want to experiment. So everybody wants success every time. So that's not going to happen. Even especially in startup world and in sports, you never succeed all the time. On an average, if you do well, you are fine enough. So we used to go show these prototypes to Sony those days, right? When I first went to Sony Japan, I think it was in 2009 or 2010. The guy in Sony was used to seeing brown skin guys pitching IT jobs, right? Saying, I'll take care of your IT administration, I'll automate your stuff and all that. So in this Shinagawa, is in the big suburb in Tokyo, there's this huge swanky building. I go there to this VP, and then I ask him, I'm doing this stuff, software defined radio, and I'm going to automate this stuff, and it's going to cost you so much lesser, and it's going to be so much. That guy laughed at me, and he said, you got 6,000 engineers below me, and you think you're going to do this? So 1 year later, we went back and showed it to him. Credit to him, he actually started taking interest because he knew that we were serious. And then at that time, we were really after Intel capital, because we decided very early on, after a couple of years, that there's no way we could raise money from financial institution investors, because we are playing up against something really difficult. So Intel capital, we're chasing them at that time, right? And Intel was trying to get into this business at that time of set-top boxes and all of that. And for 1.5 years, we're chasing Intel. They said, no, we don't want to invest in you, right? This is, I don't think you guys can build it. And the guy in Sony, I think, this is my assessment, he said, these guys, if I wanted, you go get a technology like that. And that's how Intel came and invested in us first in 2011. And then we got General Motors in. But having said that, all the blame of not raising money, we did raise about $30 million, which is very good for a semiconductor company. Still not enough, right? And everybody's nephews and nieces today are raising about 500 billion, 600 billion, at 2 billion and 3 billion. Sometimes we wonder what we do, right? And right now we are profitable. We are, we have very good EBITDA margins and all of that. So we still are not able to raise that kind of money. So that part, that link between finance and technology, that's another lesson, right? Is also very important. The link between you and the customer, and you and a finance. I realize, I think you can tell me from your experience at the end of the day, right? Sometimes, you put money because you trust a guy. You say, I don't know where this is headed, right? I just want to be part of it. So that trust is something that we had not built in the finance community. I think that is, also an important thing, because later on, I asked my board member who invested in Happiest Minds, right? Said, services company, man. You ask me all kinds of questions. Why are you doing? He says, he's Ashok Suta. Who are you? Said, yeah, I get your answer. So you have to build a brand for yourself, right? And that, you are trustworthy and you will deliver.
Yes. You're absolutely right. And I know, we all come with deep product backgrounds. I used to be at IBM Research, actually, Albert in Research before at the beginning of my career. So spent a lot of time actually dealing with folks in the computer science and the semiconductor research space. I think you're absolutely right. I often tell people that you need to build trust and credibility, not just that you're a smart person or you're motivated or you're driven, but that you really care about building eventually a company around here, eventually a business around here, eventually paying customers, right? So I think just the euphoria of I'm going to do something and don't worry about it, right? That doesn't go very well, because it could go very well for me individually as an angel, because I would say Parag is an amazing guy, and maybe I will also become an NH4 angel because he's just doing amazing things.
Yes.
But it will not work as an institutional investor, because I'm saying eventually is there some light at the end of the tunnel? The light could be 10 years hence, 12 years hence, 8 years hence, but it can't be. And so for that, I think you come back to the customer validation.
Yes.
Saying, so like, I don't know if you said this, but that's what I interpret, that the Sony guy giving a heads up, wink, wink to the Intel capital folks really made them more interested. But saying, okay, here is a large prospective customer that says this is for real. And like, if it works, I'm going to take it. Yes. That would go a long way, in my opinion.
Yes. In fact, that's how we got our money. And then because of Intel, we got General Motors. In fact, we had got marquee investors, right? We got General Motors also as investors. So at some point in time.
Correct. How did you overcome the challenge of not having an ecosystem? So one is the general kind of like, there are not, friends and brothers and sisters to hang out with, right? That's okay. But in terms of getting your stuff manufactured, in terms of dealing with, supply chain, in terms of the go-to-market, etc. I don't mean for you to cover everything, but any one or two things that you would do in today's environment, not what it was, say, 15 years ago, that you would recommend, saying, look, if you're doing a semiconductor or a hardware software company, try these 2-3 things right away, because these are now available that were not available back 10 years ago.
Yeah. So right now, there's something called a VCA when you want to talk to vendors, right? There's an aggregator, just like there are aggregators everywhere. There are silicon aggregators. So if you want to build a chip, instead of you talking to TSMC directly or the big guys directly, you go through these VCS. They will kind of put you through. So those models are available for doing chips now. And then there is also, we have ensured that as part of the ecosystem, we have created in fact, my co-founder Hemant was one of the key contributors to founding of a semiconductor accelerator called Safal here in Bangalore. So tools are available. Those things are much easily available. And again, like I said, there's a difference between an ecosystem and a bunch of engineers. And we also realize there's a difference between a bunch of smart engineers and a company. As technologists, sometimes as tinkerers, we tend to focus too much on the technology aspect. In fact, one of my co-founders full-time just does now contracts, because these contracts are far more complicated than building the product itself. You make one mistake in one of the contracts and your business can just vanish, right? So you have to have good lawyers. In fact, when we were writing patents, it was too expensive for us to hire US lawyers. So what we did was, in fact, we created this couple of local guys here in India along with us and helped them write. In fact, now they write our patents. And then in the US, we only get a couple of hours of the US lawyer, so that our overall cost per patent comes down. So those are the things that you can do. Then on the sales and the marketing side is something that we should be constantly looking at. In fact, the different pivots that we have done in the company is largely because I have always been thinking about where all can my product be actually used. Attending shows, networking with people, and also all these things give you the go-to-market. In fact, we had introduced a SaaS type of model already, and we have got a patent around it for some of our chips for software way back in 2012 or 2013. Those are the things that you have to constantly look at. And I also think it's a process. There's not a cookbook recipe that this will work or that will work. And by and large, you have to try a few things before you actually hit onto the right part. But for us, luckily, we chose a product line which is not a point product, right? It was not really a point product, but it was more of a platform. It could serve a whole bunch of industries. Like, for example, when we started when we first built our first chip, we said we'll never do satellite communications on the chip. But our first orders came on satellite communications because ISRO, we have this very deep partnership with ISRO. So you don't know. You have to be able to change around, as we move around in the this thing. And then the other thing is trying to build everything in-house, right? So try and collaborate. In India, we don't tend to collaborate. See, this is another problem that we have, right? We view everybody as competition, and you can be friends and enemies, right? I think this is one good thing I see about Taiwan and other places is that they're frenemies. They're friends and enemies. They compete, but they're still an ecosystem, right? That's something that I think we need to do, especially when it's a fledgling and a nascent ecosystem. Everybody should be together in this. And luckily now, finally, the government has realized after 12, 13 years that just selling underwear on internet is not enough, and mentioning those unicorns in parliament is not enough. You need the base, right? You need the base to run all these things, and that's where semiconductors and hardware comes in. In spite of all the issues that we have with China, we still have to pay them $100 billion. We have a trade deficit of $100 billion, right, of worth of import. So those, at least now there is that awareness. So it's a little bit easier than when we started off.
Fantastic, Parag. As we get close to wrapping up here, one last question from my side, which is on intellectual property and patents. And typically in the kind of companies that we at Prime get involved in, there is a lot of, call it trade secrets, call it sort of internal IP, etc. But patenting is not that common yet. So how are you kind of dealing with that? Obviously, because patenting is very important in your space. And are you doing global patents? Are you doing India patents? Are you doing defensive disclosures? Just talk to us a little bit about some best practices on patents, where they work, and how do you do it as an entrepreneur, especially at the early stage, because they are expensive to really
absolutely.
go whole hog.
Absolutely. Yeah, actually, you know what? We've been the biggest hit because of not patenting in Smart Intra. If we had patented the screencasting technology, we would have been collecting money from practically every mobile phone vendor, right? So that's the lesson. So the problem with patents is, again, at the top level, then I'll come to some of the best practices. You don't know which one is going to succeed. It's like art, right? It's like abstract art. You don't know there's going to be a Van Gogh when you make one. That's why what we do as a principle, what we do is when in doubt, you patent. It costs you money, but it's worth it. So what we have done, like I told you right earlier, we have a situation where we make most of the patent applications here in Bangalore in India. There are quite a few right now. In fact, there are one or two when we started out. Now there are 10, 15 people who do it. And a lot of people are getting there. And then get some of the things done in US. And as a principle, we file in India and US simultaneously, because once you get in India, you also get it in the US. And then selectively, based on our discussions with lawyer and our own assessment, we then go file in different countries, like for example, Japan and some countries in EU and Korea and so on. So some of our patents are global. In fact, one of our patents is one of the most cited patents actually. We have got about 124 citations on that patent. So that's a global patent. See, it's like a Gaussian distribution for patents as well, right? There are some things, one or two in 50 will really take off. The rest of them are feathers in the cap, but you don't know which one of them. So you have to continuously keep filing. In fact, in our company, we have incentives for filing patents. When they file a patent, when they get a patent, and we have a rewarding system also we're putting in place right now to recognize inventors and create that invention process there. And then when not to patent is also important. Sometimes you don't want to give away some of your secrets, so that time you keep that as a trade secret. There are a couple of them that we have not patented because we just don't want anybody else to know what we're doing. So there's a know why and the know how, right? Sometimes the know how you try to do it. Sometimes the know why you don't try and keep it as trade secrets.
Just a quick word, Parag, on what is the typical cost, especially if you're just doing either a defensive patent, India only, or global, just for people's benchmarking? Like, what is the typical cost you can expect?
I think in India and US, if we do, typically we can get a patent under 2.5 lakh rupees, which is not that bad. 2.5 to 3 lakh rupees.
That's not that much. It used to be much more expensive 15 years ago.
Exactly. And then both the Karnataka government, at least in Bangalore, and the central government gives you reimbursement, right, on top of it for some of those patents. But don't always rely on it, because one of the patents that we wanted to get reimbursement for, the committee in Delhi said that this is too innovative to be patented. I know why somebody else would have thought about it. So that's the challenge you have when you're dealing with government of India. So, but then the USPTO didn't think about that, so they gave us the patent.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Parag. From movies to Shivaji to interesting quotes on autotelic personalities. Fantastic podcast, and thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Amit. Pleasure talking to you.
Dear listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast app for free, and you'll be the first one to know when new episodes are available. Just search for Prime Venture Partners Podcast in Apple Podcast, Spotify, Castbox, or however you get your podcasts. Then hit subscribe. And if you have enjoyed the show, we would be really grateful if you leave us a review on Apple Podcast. To read the full transcript, find the link in the show notes.